Her routine was a precisely calibrated measure of safety and control. Every morning, Warden Sarah Chen arrived at the gates of Black Creek State Correctional Facility near Milledgeville, Georgia, at precisely 6:45 a.m., her life outside the razor-wire perimeter seemingly undisturbed. She supervised a population of nearly 2,000 inmates and a staff of hundreds, navigating a world governed by rigid rules and predictable procedures. The facility, a sprawling complex of concrete and steel set back from State Route 22, was a place where order was paramount, a necessary bulwark against the chaos it contained. No one outside her closest professional circle, and certainly none of the inmates within the tiered cell blocks, suspected the quiet devastation that was already seeping into her carefully managed world, eroding the very foundation of her existence. The facade of control she presented was meticulously maintained, a professional armor necessary for survival in this environment. Yet, behind the composed exterior, a hidden reality had taken root, a dangerous deviation from the prescribed path. This deviation began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, a quiet erosion of the boundaries that defined her professional life and ensured her safety. The rigid structure of the institution, designed to prevent unauthorized access and illicit contact, proved unexpectedly fragile when confronted with human vulnerability and forbidden desire. Her daily ingress through the sally port, the clanging of the heavy doors behind her, marked a transition into a separate reality, one where the dangers were known and managed. Or so she believed. The unexpected threat emerged, not from the predicted sources of inmate violence or institutional breakdown, but from a far more insidious origin, one born of secrecy and proximity within the controlled environment. The standard operating procedures, the security protocols, the layers of supervision, none were designed to detect or prevent the quiet, deliberate crossing of lines that occurred out of sight, beyond the reach of surveillance cameras and routine patrols. Her office, a sparsely decorated room on the administrative floor, overlooking the main yard, was a sanctuary of authority, a place where decisions were made that impacted lives, but it was also, perhaps, a place of unintended isolation, a remove from the daily interactions that might have offered different perspectives or warnings. The sheer volume of inmates, each with their own history and complexities, meant that individuals often blended into the population, their personal narratives largely unknown to the upper administration, unless they caused significant disruption. Marcus Thorne was, initially, one of these individuals, inmate number 3789, serving a sentence for aggravated fraud, a charge that spoke to manipulation but not physical violence. His file noted a high level of intelligence and a history of charming those around him, skills often honed and amplified within the confines of incarceration. He was assigned to a work detail in the administrative annex, performing custodial duties and minor repairs, a position that offered slightly more freedom of movement and access than the general population. It was this proximity, this blurring of the clear lines between staff and inmate, that provided the opportunity for the secret to begin its quiet, destructive growth. The initial interactions were professional, brief exchanges in hallways or supply closets, the mundane necessities of institutional operation. Sarah Chen, as warden, interacted with numerous inmates in supervised capacities, maintaining a professional distance dictated by policy and common sense. But with Marcus Thorne, the distance began to subtly, dangerously shrink. Perhaps it was a shared moment of unexpected understanding, a flicker of connection across the institutional divide, or simply the persistent, skilled application of Thorne's particular talents for influence. Whatever the catalyst, the professional barrier began to soften, a hairline crack appearing in the carefully constructed wall. The secure corridors and locked doors designed to keep the outside world out and the inside world contained inadvertently facilitated a different kind of isolation, one that allowed a forbidden bond to form in the hidden corners of the facility. The sterile environment of the prison, usually a stark contrast to the complexities of life beyond its walls, became the unlikely incubator for a relationship that defied logic and protocol. The first instances were innocent enough, a longer than necessary conversation about a repair, a shared observation about the tedious nature of institutional life. These moments, small deviations from the norm, were easily rationalized, dismissed as minor infractions in the face of overwhelming daily responsibilities. But they were the thin edge of the wedge, the initial breach that would widen over time. The rigid schedule of the prison, designed for predictability, paradoxically created pockets of opportunity for clandestine contact. Late nights at the office, Early mornings before staff arrived, the quiet hours when surveillance was less vigilant or focused elsewhere. These became the backdrops for interactions that moved beyond the professional sphere. The danger was inherent, obvious to any observer with knowledge of correctional environments. Yet for Sarah Chen, the lines blurred. The risk seemed, perhaps, less significant than the unexpected human connection she found. The concrete and steel of Black Creek held many stories within its walls, narratives of crime and punishment, of loss and attempted rehabilitation. But the story unfolding between Warden Chen and inmate Thorne was a different kind of narrative, one of profound human frailty and the catastrophic consequences of forbidden intimacy in a place where boundaries were not just rules but essential safeguards. The subtle shifts in her demeanor, the private moments of preoccupation, were perhaps noticed by some, but the true nature of her distraction remained hidden, an unknown variable in the predictable equation of prison administration. The secret festered in the hidden spaces, growing in intensity and risk, a ticking clock counting down to the inevitable moment of exposure or self-destruction. The quiet normalcy of her arrival each morning, the routine of her day within the controlled chaos of the prison, remained outwardly unchanged, but the foundation had been compromised, and the first signs of structural failure were already present, waiting only for the right pressure to reveal the hidden damage. The stage was set, not in a dramatic clash of wills in the open yard, but in the quiet corners of the institution, where secrets thrived and consequences multiplied unseen. The secret affair took root in the marginal spaces of the prison, away from the main corridors and open areas, in places where the rigid schedule sometimes allowed for brief, unsupervised moments. A utility closet on the second floor, rarely used by staff. A small, disused storage room adjacent to the administrative library. Even the loading dock area during shift changes when attention was diverted. These were the clandestine meeting points, locations chosen not for comfort, but for the minimal risk of observation. The cold, institutional air hung heavy in these spaces, carrying the faint sense of disinfectant, stale paper, and confined bodies, a stark contrast to the intimacy attempting to form within them. Inmate Thorne, with his work detail providing him access to different areas, facilitated these encounters, navigating the prison's geography with a practiced ease that came from years of confinement and keen observation. He understood the blind spots in the surveillance, the routines of the patrol officers, the moments when staff were most likely to be elsewhere. Sarah Chen, operating outside her usual administrative sphere, relied on his knowledge of the facility's hidden nooks and crannies, a dependence that further blurred the lines of authority and control. The interactions moved from brief conversations to prolonged, whispered meetings, exchanging words and eventually, quiet touches in the dim light of forgotten corners. The risk was immense, a violation of fundamental correctional policy with potentially career-ending if not legally compromising consequences. Yet, the gravitational pull of the forbidden connection seemed to outweigh the institutional imperatives. Thorne possessed a particular charm, an ability to make individuals feel seen and understood, a potent skill against the backdrop of institutional anonymity and emotional deprivation. He listened intently, offered empathy that was scarce within the prison walls, and created a sense of shared vulnerability that chipped away at Sarah Chen's professional reserve. For her, perhaps, the affair offered an escape from the immense pressure of her job, a fleeting moment of personal connection in a life dominated by sterile procedure and human depravity. The details of their communication were obscured by the need for secrecy. There were no easily traceable phone calls or emails. Communication relied on smuggled notes. Whispered messages passed through trusted intermediaries. If any, the risk of involving others was high, or direct exchanges during their clandestine meetings. The sheer logistical difficulty of maintaining the affair within the prison walls added another layer of tension, a constant undercurrent of anxiety beneath the developing relationship. Every glance shared across a busy hallway, every unexpected encounter, every moment spent together carried the weight of potential discovery. The threat of exposure was not just professional ruin, it was a security breach that could compromise the entire institution. Yet, the affair continued, fueled by a dangerous combination of human needs and institutional vulnerabilities. Thorne's motives remained complex. Perhaps a genuine connection existed alongside a calculated manipulation of power dynamics. For an inmate, a relationship with a high-ranking official offered potential advantages, influence, or simply a sense of control denied in every other aspect of their life. Whether Sarah Chen fully grasped the potential for manipulation at the time is unclear. perhaps blinded by the emotional isolation of her position, or Thorne's skillful deception. The affair escalated, crossing physical boundaries that were meant to be inviolable within the prison environment. These encounters, brief and fraught with peril, occurred in the same hidden spaces, adding another layer of risk and secrecy. The stark reality of their surroundings, the cold concrete floors, the echoing sounds of the prison, the ever-present threat of discovery, stood in stark contrast to the moments of intimacy. The emotional landscape of the relationship was undoubtedly complex, a mix of genuine feeling, forbidden thrill, and underlying power imbalances inherent in the warden-inmate dynamic. The professional competence Sarah Chan exhibited during her working hours masked a growing internal conflict, a division between her public persona and her hidden private life. She continued to perform her duties, attend meetings and oversee operations, maintaining the illusion of control while her personal world spiraled into dangerous territory. The potential consequences of discovery loomed large, a constant, unspoken threat. Had anyone connected the subtle changes in her behavior, the moments of distraction, with inmate Thorne, the entire carefully constructed world of Black Creek could have been irrevocably damaged. The affair was a profound violation of trust, a betrayal of her colleagues, the institution, and the public she served. As the relationship deepened, the risks multiplied. The longer the secret persisted, the greater the chance of a slip-up, a moment of inattention, a detail overlooked that could expose everything. The air within the hidden meeting places grew thicker with unspoken tension, and the weight of the forbidden. The initial spark of connection had ignited a fire that was now burning dangerously close to the surface, threatening to consume everything in its path. The question was not if the secret would be revealed, but when and how, and what the inevitable fallout would entail for both Sarah Chen and the institution she commanded. The quiet hum of the prison's operations continued, oblivious to the human drama unfolding in its unseen corners, a drama that was building towards an inevitable, devastating climax. The first symptoms arrived subtly, easily dismissed as stress or the demands of her high-pressure job. Persistent fatigue, a lingering sense of malaise, minor ailments that seemed unremarkable on their own. Sarah Chen initially attributed them to the long hours, the constant vigilance required of a prison warden, the inherent strain of managing an environment teeming with potential conflict. She pushed through, adhering to her rigid schedule, maintaining her professional facade. The physical discomfort was an unwelcome distraction, but not yet a cause for significant alarm. As the weeks passed, however, the symptoms worsened, becoming more pronounced and less ignorable. Unusual infections, unexplained weight loss, a general deterioration in her health that could no longer be attributed solely to overwork. Concern began to replace dismissal. The quiet strength she projected at Black Creek State Correctional Facility began to feel like a performance, requiring more and more effort to maintain. Her colleagues likely noticed a change, a slight weariness around her eyes, a diminished energy level, but attributed it to the perennial stresses of the job, another casualty of the demanding environment. The idea that something fundamental was wrong, something requiring medical attention beyond simple rest, began to settle in. She decided to seek medical advice, opting to visit a physician outside of Milledgeville in a neighboring town. A conscious choice driven by a need for privacy. The institutional healthcare providers at Black Creek were too close, their knowledge of her position too intertwined with her professional life. She needed anonymity, a clinical assessment free from the context of her role as warden. The doctor's office was sterile, impersonal, a standard medical environment far removed from the locked doors and security checks of the prison. She described her symptoms, underwent examinations, and provided blood samples for testing. The process was routine, methodical, the physician asking standard questions about her health, lifestyle, and potential exposures. At this point, the possibility of the truth was likely not even a conscious thought, buried deep beneath layers of denial and the sheer improbability of the situation. The days that followed were filled with the usual responsibilities of her job, the pressing issues of prison administration occupying her time and focus. But an underlying anxiety began to build, a quiet dread anticipating the results of the medical tests. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in her office, reviewing security logs. The mundane details of prison life spread across her desk. The physician's voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, delivering information with clinical detachment. The language used was precise, medical terms that cut through the noise of her daily concerns. Positive. The word hung in the air, heavy and disorienting. HIV. The diagnosis was confirmed. It was a devastating blow, a medical reality that shattered the illusion of her controlled world. The immediate aftermath was likely a blur of shock and disbelief, the clinical words echoing in the quiet of her office. How? The question was instantaneous, primal. And then, the dawning horrific realization. The only possible answer based on the reality of her hidden life. There was only one way this could have happened. One source for this devastating infection. The secret affair, the dangerous crossing of boundaries, the hidden moments of intimacy in the unseen corners of the prison. They had carried a cost far greater than professional ruin. Marcus Thorne. The name solidified in her mind. No longer just an inmate number or a forbidden lover, but the probable vector of a life-altering disease. The devastation was profound, not just the medical prognosis, but the crushing weight of betrayal and the catastrophic consequences of her own choices. The sterility of the diagnosis felt a chilling echo of the sterile environment where the infection was contracted. The clinical clarity of the medical report contrasted sharply with the emotional chaos erupting within her. This was not a curable ailment, but a chronic condition with significant implications for her health and future. The diagnosis was a hard, undeniable fact, a medical truth that ripped away the layers of denial she may have built around the affair. It transformed the secret relationship from a dangerous indulgence into a life-threatening act with irreversible consequences. Her perception of Marcus Thorne undoubtedly shifted in that moment, the complex mix of emotions likely giving way to a stark, unforgiving clarity. The man with whom she had shared forbidden intimacy was now inextricably linked to this devastating medical reality. The sterile report in her hand was a physical manifestation of the hidden cost of her actions. The professional world outside her office continued its predictable rhythm, the clanging of doors, the distant shouts, the hum of institutional life. But inside, her world had stopped. The diagnosis was not just a medical event, it was a catalyst, a turning point that would propel the hidden narrative towards its violent conclusion. The quiet devastation had found its concrete form, leaving her to grapple with a reality far more brutal than the controlled environment she commanded. The path forward was unclear, but the knowledge she now possessed, the devastating truth of her infection and its source, would inevitably dictate her next steps, leading her down a road from which there was no return. The aftermath of the diagnosis was a period of intense internal turmoil, a silent storm raging behind the composed exterior Warden Sarah Chen presented to the world. While she continued her duties, the weight of the medical truth and its source pressed down on her, altering her perception of everything around her. The sterile hallways of Black Creek, once just the backdrop of her professional life, now felt tainted, the site of a profound and irreversible violation. Her interactions with staff and inmates, previously governed by routine and policy, were now filtered through the lens of her secret reality and the devastating consequences it had wrought. The emotional restraint she habitually employed was now a necessary shield, protecting the explosive truth lurking beneath the surface. She began to investigate Marcus Thorne, not through official channels that would raise suspicion, but through discreet inquiries and the re-examination of his existing file. The official records detailed his crime, aggravated fraud, a pattern of sophisticated deception. They noted his behavior within the prison, generally compliant, intelligent, often charming. But these records offered little insight into the man capable of such a profound personal betrayal, or perhaps, deliberate harm. The key reveal, anticipated at this midpoint of the narrative, emerged not from a single document, but from piecing together fragments of information and applying the brutal clarity of her own experience. Inmate Thorne had a history of manipulating individuals for his own gain, a pattern evident in his original conviction. What the official file did not explicitly state, but what became horrifyingly clear upon deeper, biased examination, was the method of his manipulation. He was skilled at identifying vulnerabilities, at creating a false sense of intimacy and trust, at exploiting emotional needs. Sarah Chen, in her isolation and perhaps susceptibility, had been the latest target of a practiced con artist, one whose canvas had expanded from financial fraud to personal devastation within the confines of the prison. Furthermore, veiled within medical notes, or inmate reports that she accessed discreetly, was information suggesting Marcus Thorne's prior knowledge of his own HIV status. This is the crucial midpoint twist. The affair was not merely a reckless liaison, with unintended tragic consequences. It was potentially an act of deliberate transmission, a final cruel manipulation, inflicted upon the woman who had crossed every boundary for him. This reveal transformed the narrative from a story of a tragic, forbidden love affair gone wrong into something far more sinister, a potential crime of malicious intent preceding the ultimate act of violence. The knowledge of Thorne's potential deliberate action ignited a different kind of pain, a searing anger layered upon the devastation of her diagnosis. She was not just a victim of circumstance or poor judgment. She was potentially the victim of a calculated attack, carried out under the guise of intimacy within the very institution she commanded. This realization accelerated the internal crisis. The slow burn of her initial shock gave way to a potent mixture of fear, rage, and a desperate need for control in a situation where she had lost so much. The clinical detachment she usually employed was strained to its breaking point by the raw, personal nature of this betrayal. Every interaction with Thorne became fraught with this new understanding. Seeing him perform his assigned duties, observing his seemingly normal interactions with staff or other inmates, became an agonizing exercise in restraint. The man who appeared compliant, and even charming to others was, in her eyes, now a predator who had inflicted a life-altering harm upon her, possibly with intent. The prison walls that had once symbolized order and control now felt like the boundaries of her personal cage, trapping her with the man who had devastated her life. The need to confront him, to understand the depth of his betrayal, became paramount, overriding her professional judgment, and the inherent danger of such an encounter. The meticulous details of her daily routine, once a source of stability, now felt like a suffocating performance, a denial of the horrific reality she carried within her. The secret affair had led to a devastating diagnosis, and that diagnosis, coupled with the dawning realization of intentional harm, was propelling her towards a confrontation that would have irreversible consequences. The sterile environment of Black Creek, the site of the initial transgression and the source of her despair, was about to become the stage for a final, violent reckoning. A desperate act born from a profound sense of injustice and personal annihilation. The rules of the institution, the procedures she had spent years enforcing, were no longer her primary concern. A different, more primal set of imperatives had taken hold, driven by betrayal, rage, and the life-altering damage she had sustained within its walls. The confrontation occurred not in a hidden closet, but in a place that offered a semblance of privacy yet still allowed for controlled interaction within the prison hierarchy. Sarah Chen summoned Marcus Thorne to a small, rarely used conference room in the administrative wing, a neutral space removed from inmate population areas, but still within the secure perimeter. The room was bare, furnished only with a rectangular table and a few chairs. The walls painted a standard institutional beige. The air was still, the silence broken only by the faint, omnipresent hum of the prison facility. Thorne arrived, escorted by a correctional officer, a standard procedure for inmate movement outside designated areas. The officer remained outside the closed door, a silent, unaware sentinel guarding a meeting whose true nature was hidden. Sarah Chen dismissed the officer, stating she needed to speak to the inmate alone about a work detail assignment, a plausible but deceptive explanation. Thorne entered the room, his expression expectant, perhaps assuming this was another opportunity for clandestine interaction. He likely saw it as a continuation of their forbidden relationship, a chance for a private moment with the warden. He was unaware of the true purpose of this meeting, unaware that the dynamic between them had fundamentally and irrevocably shifted. Sarah Chen remained standing behind the table, her posture rigid, her face a mask of forced composure. There were no preliminary pleasantries, no return to the facade of their secret intimacy. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and even, stripped of all warmth or emotion, the clinical clarity of her diagnosis informing every syllable. "I know," she stated, the words hanging in the air. "I know about the diagnosis." Thorne's expression likely changed in that moment, a flicker of something: surprise, fear, perhaps even recognition of the trap he was in. He may have attempted to deny it, to charm his way out of it, to revert to the manipulative tactics that had served him before. But the evidence was irrefutable, carried within Sarah Chen's own body. The conversation, though dialogue is used sparingly, was likely brief and impactful, a few exchanged sentences carrying the weight of everything that had passed between them, and everything that was now at stake. Sarah Chen presented the medical reality, perhaps mentioning the specific diagnosis, the devastating truth of her infection. Thorne's response was crucial, the final catalyst. Did he confess? Did he show remorse? Or did he reveal the full extent of his depravity, confirming her fear of deliberate transmission? Based on the accelerating narrative and the trajectory towards violence, his reaction likely solidified her conviction that he was not merely irresponsible, but actively malicious. He may have displayed indifference, a chilling lack of empathy for the devastation he had caused. He may have threatened her, perhaps with exposure of the affair, attempting to regain control through blackmail, or he may have simply confirmed her fears with a cold, stark admission, devoid of any regret. Whatever his words or demeanor, they cemented her resolve. The man across the table was not a partner, but a perpetrator. The life-altering damage he had inflicted demanded a response that superseded institutional rules and legal consequences. The confrontation in the sterile conference room became the crucible where her pain, rage, and sense of betrayal boiled over. Reaching a critical point, the sterile beige walls seemed to absorb the tension, witnessing a private reckoning hidden from the rest of the facility. The brief exchange was the culmination of months of secrecy, risk, and devastating consequences. It was the moment when the hidden personal drama intersected violently with the rigid reality of the prison environment. The decision was made in that room, forged in the fire of her diagnosis and the chilling confirmation of Thorne's nature. The path towards justice as she now perceived it lay outside the legal system that incarcerated him. Outside the procedures she had sworn to uphold, it lay in a final, irreversible act that would end his ability to harm. Born from a desperate need for retribution and a profound sense of having nothing left to lose, the silence that followed their exchange was likely heavy, pregnant with unspoken threats and the weight of the decision she had made. The conference room, designed for sterile institutional discussions, became the antechamber of a violent death. The officer waiting outside remained unaware, the mundane reality of prison life continuing just beyond the door, oblivious to the quiet storm that had just passed, and the devastating act it would precipitate. The lines between warden and inmate, between control and chaos, between justice and vengeance, had dissolved completely for Sarah Chen. The act itself was swift and deliberate, carried out shortly after the confrontation in the conference room. The location was carefully chosen, an area within the prison where Marcus Thorne had assigned duties that provided a window of opportunity for unsupervised access, however brief. It wasn't a cell block which would be too secure and monitored, nor a wide-open area like the yard. Instead, it was likely a less trafficked service area, perhaps a small workshop or a storage annex connected to his work detail, accessible to Sarah Chen under the guise of inspecting his work or delivering instructions. This specific method, while not graphically detailed, was effective and ensured Thorne's incapacitation and subsequent death. It was executed with a chilling efficiency that spoke to premeditation, not a spontaneous act of rage, but a planned, albeit quickly conceived response to the reality of her situation. She used an object readily available within the prison environment, something that would not immediately point to her as the perpetrator if discovered out of context, or perhaps something she had discreetly brought with her knowing this confrontation was a possibility. The element of surprise was key. Thorne was likely not expecting physical violence from the warden, especially after their intense, emotionally charged conversation. The struggle was brief, contained within the confines of the small, isolated space. The sounds, if any, were muffled by the ambient noise of the prison or the thick concrete walls. The act was focused, targeting him directly and lethally. There was no hesitation, no turning back once the decision had been made in the conference room. Sarah Chen, the professional warden, had transformed into an instrument of retribution. The years of maintaining control, of enforcing order within the institution, had perhaps paradoxically honed a capacity for decisive, calculated action, albeit now directed towards a forbidden end. The sterile environment, which had facilitated the hidden affair and delivered the devastating diagnosis, now witnessed the violent culmination of the secret. The objective was clear: to ensure Marcus Thorne could no longer inflict harm, to enact a final brutal form of justice for the life-altering damage she had sustained. The act was not born of passion in the traditional sense, but from a cold, hard resolve forged by betrayal, illness, and the chilling realization of deliberate harm. It was a violation of the most fundamental rule of her profession, the preservation of life and the maintenance of order. But in her mind, order had already been destroyed by Thorne's actions, and her own life fundamentally altered. The space where the act occurred held its secrets as effectively as any locked cell. The presence of equipment or materials related to Thorne's work detail provided a veneer of normalcy to the setting, allowing Sarah Chen to be there without immediately raising alarms. The lack of witnesses was crucial, a testament to her knowledge of the prison's blind spots and her careful timing. She left the area, as discreetly as she had entered, rejoining the predictable flow of institutional life, her outward composure seemingly intact. The physical reality of what she had just done existed in stark contrast to the calm she now projected. Marcus Thorne lay dead, the hidden consequences of their affair made violently manifest in a forgotten corner of Black Creek State Correctional Facility. The air in the space settled, carrying the silent weight of the completed act. The objects around him, tools, cleaning supplies, stored equipment, remained inanimate witnesses to the violence. The discovery was not immediate, allowing Sarah Chen a period of time to regain her composure and attempt to distance herself from the scene. The prison continued its operations, unaware that one of its inmates was dead and its warden was now a killer. The careful steps taken to conceal her involvement began immediately. An instinctive shift back into the mode of control and damage limitation, albeit now focused on protecting herself from the consequences of her actions. The act was completed, irreversible, a final desperate response to an unbearable reality, conducted within the very walls that had contained their secret and delivered her fate. The discovery of Marcus Thorne's body initiated a rapid and predictable sequence of events within Black Creek State Correctional Facility, pulling back the curtain on the hidden reality that had existed within its walls. The alarm was raised during a routine check, likely when Thorne failed to report back to his assigned area, or when a staff member accessed the specific service area where his body lay. The initial responders were correctional officers, their routine immediately shattered by the grim discovery. The scene was secured swiftly. Yellow crime scene tape, a stark visual cue of disruption, appearing within the usually ordered confines of the prison. The facility went into lockdown, a standard procedure to contain any potential ongoing threat and preserve the integrity of the scene. The atmosphere shifted instantly from controlled routine to heightened alert. The quiet hum of the prison replaced by a palpable tension. Senior prison officials were notified, and Warden Sarah Chen was among the first on the scene. Her professional demeanor seemingly appropriate for the gravity of the situation. Her presence was expected, her oversight necessary during a major incident. However, for her the scene was far more than a professional crisis. It was the physical manifestation of her secret and its violent culmination. Law enforcement was immediately contacted, initiating an external investigation into a death within the state correctional system. Detectives from the local police department, or the Georgia Bureau of Investigation (GBI) arrived, their presence introducing an outside perspective into the closed world of the prison. They began the methodical process of crime scene investigation, documenting everything, searching for physical evidence, and establishing a preliminary timeline. The body of Marcus Thorne was examined, providing crucial forensic details about the cause and time of death, the manner in which he was killed, the specific object used, left forensic clues that would be meticulously analyzed. Responding officers and prison staff who were present during the initial discovery provided brief statements, their accounts focusing on the factual circumstances of finding the body and the immediate lockdown. These statements were carefully selected by investigators for their relevance, capturing the initial disorientation and the first pieces of information about the scene. The focus of the investigation was immediately on who had access to the specific area and the opportunity to commit the act. Prison staff were primary suspects, given the location and the level of access required to be in that part of the facility without immediate scrutiny. Inmates were also considered, though the method and location might narrow the possibilities. Sarah Chen, as warden, was initially involved in overseeing the prison's response to the incident, coordinating with law enforcement, and ensuring the facility remained secure. Her knowledge of the prison's layout, staff movements, and inmate assignments was ostensibly a resource for the investigation. However, her own involvement placed her in an extraordinarily precarious position, requiring a performance of professional detachment while concealing a devastating secret. The investigation proceeded methodically, a stark procedural contrast to the emotional turmoil hidden beneath the surface. Forensic teams meticulously collected evidence from the scene: fibers, fingerprints, biological material, anything that could link a perpetrator to the death. Security camera footage, if available for that specific area, which was likely a blind spot given Chen's choice of location, was reviewed, though its absence or lack of clarity would itself become a point of interest. The initial stages of the investigation focused on gathering facts, documenting the scene, and identifying potential leads. There was no immediate public knowledge of the warden's hidden life or her connection to the deceased inmate. The narrative presented to the outside world, and even to most within the prison, was that of an inmate death under suspicious circumstances within a secure facility, a matter requiring thorough investigation. The quiet devastation of Sarah Chen's personal world was still largely contained, hidden behind the official response to the crisis, but the presence of external investigators, asking questions, collecting evidence, and beginning to piece together the events leading to Thorne's death, marked the inevitable unraveling of her secret. Every step of the investigation, every piece of evidence uncovered, brought the hidden truth closer to the surface, threatening to expose the forbidden affair, the devastating diagnosis, and the violent act that occurred within the prison's walls. The sterile environment, now a crime scene, held the physical proof of a breakdown in both institutional security and personal boundaries. The investigation was just beginning, its methodical process slowly chipping away at the facade of normalcy, inevitably leading back to the person who had overseen the institution while harboring its most dangerous secret. The initial shock of discovery had passed, replaced by the quiet, relentless pursuit of truth that characterizes a criminal investigation. The investigation into the death of Marcus Thorne proceeded with meticulous detail, each piece of evidence a step closer to uncovering the truth hidden behind the prison walls. Forensic analysis of Thorne's body provided the clinical specifics of his death, confirming the cause and establishing a more precise time of death. This information was crucial for building a timeline of his final hours and identifying individuals who had access to his location during that critical period. Investigators widened their scope, interviewing not only the officers who discovered the body, but also other staff members and inmates who might have had knowledge of Thorne's movements or interactions. Prison records were scrutinized, visitor logs, work detail assignments, internal incident reports, and increasingly, inmate medical files. It was through this painstaking process that investigators began to uncover anomalies, details that didn't fit the standard narrative of inmate life or typical conflicts. Rumors within the prison population, often unreliable but sometimes containing kernels of truth, may have hinted at an unusual relationship involving Thorne. Staff observations, initially dismissed as office gossip or speculation, might have taken on new significance in light of the homicide investigation. The focus began to shift subtly, guided by the emerging timeline and the individuals whose access and behavior warranted closer examination. Warden Sarah Chen, due to her position and access to all areas of the facility, was initially a key source of information for the investigators. However, as the timeline solidified and the potential pool of suspects narrowed, her own movements and interactions came under closer scrutiny. Investigators operate on data, on facts, and the facts were beginning to point towards a connection that defied institutional norms. The discovery of communication methods not typically used between staff and inmates, perhaps a discarded note found during a search, or information gleaned from digital forensics if any digital devices were involved, less likely in a prison setting, but not impossible through smuggled items or compromised systems, would have been a significant development. These pieces of information, combined with observations of Sarah Chen's behavior, or any inconsistencies in her account of the day Thorne died, began to build a compelling, albeit initially circumstantial case. The most significant turning point in the investigation was likely the discovery of the secret affair. This could have emerged from multiple sources: an inmate witness who had observed an unusual interaction, a staff member who had noticed something amiss, or perhaps, most damningly, evidence found during a search related to Thorne or even Sarah Chen herself, though a search of the warden's personal effects would require significant justification. Once the affair was suspected, the motive for Thorne's death became chillingly clear, and the investigation accelerated dramatically, focusing squarely on Sarah Chen. The discovery of her recent medical diagnosis, specifically her HIV status, would have provided the crucial link, transforming a forbidden affair and a suspicious death into a potential murder driven by a devastating personal motive. Access to her medical records, likely obtained through a legal process once she became a primary suspect, would have confirmed the diagnosis and potentially revealed the timing of her infection, aligning it with the time frame of the affair. This is where the threads of the secret life, the medical reality, and the criminal investigation converged. The meticulous documentation of the investigation, forensic reports, witness statements, timeline reconstructions, painted a clear, damning picture. It showed the progression from a rule-breaking relationship to a life-altering illness, culminating in a violent act within the controlled environment of the prison. Investigators would have methodically traced the steps leading up to Thorne's death, placing Sarah Chen in the vicinity at the critical time, and establishing the means and opportunity. The contrast between her public image as a respected warden and the hidden reality of her affair and its tragic consequences would have been stark, providing a compelling albeit disturbing narrative for the prosecution. The evidence solidified against her, piece by painstaking piece, leaving little room for alternative explanation. The investigation, conducted with clinical precision, dismantled the carefully constructed facade of her life, exposing the quiet devastation she had carried and the extreme measures she had taken in its wake. The institutional walls of Black Creek, designed to contain inmates, had ultimately failed to contain the destructive force of a secret affair and its catastrophic fallout, culminating in the death of an inmate and the inevitable downfall of its warden. With the evidence mounting and pointing directly at Warden Sarah Chen, the legal proceedings began. She was arrested, the public spectacle of a high-ranking correctional official being taken into custody sending shockwaves through the community of Milledgeville and the state correctional system. The charges were severe: murder, potentially aggravated murder depending on the specifics of the act and the state's statutes. The arrest transformed her status from respected warden to accused killer. The contrast between her public persona and the allegations against her stark and unsettling. Legal documents outlining the charges were filed, formalizing the state's case against her. The details of the investigation, meticulously compiled by law enforcement, formed the basis of the prosecution's strategy. They would present the timeline of the secret affair, the devastating medical diagnosis she received, and the evidence placing her at the scene of Marcus Thorne's death. The motive, central to the prosecution's narrative, was clear: vengeance for contracting HIV from the inmate with whom she had a forbidden relationship. The legal process moved forward, characterized by formal procedures and the adversarial nature of the courtroom. There were preliminary hearings, motions filed by both the prosecution and the defense, and the painstaking process of jury selection. Sarah Chen was represented by legal counsel, tasked with navigating the complex legal landscape and formulating a defense strategy. The defense faced a challenging task. They could attempt to discredit the evidence, argue for a lesser charge like manslaughter, perhaps claiming the act was committed in the heat of passion or under extreme emotional distress, though the planning suggested otherwise, or present a narrative that mitigated her culpability. The fact of the secret affair and the HIV diagnosis were difficult, if not impossible, to dispute, as medical records and witness testimony would likely confirm them. The legal arguments revolved around intent, opportunity, and the interpretation of the forensic evidence. Testimonies were delivered in the courtroom. Individuals from the prison staff, law enforcement, and forensic experts presenting their findings under oath. While direct quotes from a fictionalized trial cannot be provided, the essence of the testimony centered on reconstructing the events leading up to Thorne's death and establishing Sarah Chen's role. Prosecutors would have likely highlighted the calculated nature of the act, the choice of location, and her deliberate steps to conceal her involvement. They would have presented the medical evidence as a powerful motive, arguing that the life-altering diagnosis drove her to commit murder. The defense might have focused on her state of mind, the immense stress of her job, the emotional toll of the affair, and the diagnosis, attempting to evoke sympathy or suggest a diminished capacity. They might have questioned the timeline or the forensic link, though this would be difficult against a thorough investigation. Key excerpts from testimony would have underscored critical moments. Perhaps a correctional officer's account of seeing the warden enter the service area shortly before Thorne's estimated time of death, or a forensic analyst detailing the specific characteristics of the fatal injury and the likelihood of a particular type of object being used. The courtroom, a formal and often sterile environment, became the stage where the hidden drama of Black Creek was laid bare. The rules of evidence and procedure governed the presentation of the facts, translating the messy reality of human choices and their consequences into a structured legal argument. Sarah Chen, dressed in civilian clothes, sat beside her counsel, the warden's uniform replaced by the somber attire of a defendant. Her face, once a mask of authority, now reflected the immense strain of the legal battle. The quiet devastation that had begun with a secret affair and a devastating diagnosis was now being publicly dissected in a court of law. the final chapter of a tragic narrative unfolding under intense scrutiny. The legal process, with its inherent delays and procedural complexities, nonetheless moved inexorably towards a verdict, determining Sarah Chen's fate based on the evidence presented and the laws of the state of Georgia. The weight of the proceedings was immense, not just for the accused but for the families involved, the staff of Black Creek, and the community grappling with the fallout of a secret life exposed in a violent death within its correctional system. The legal proceedings culminated in a verdict that brought a formal conclusion to the state's case against Sarah Chen. The jury, after hearing the evidence and arguments presented by both the prosecution and the defense, rendered its decision. The specific verdict, whether guilty of murder, manslaughter, or another charge, determined the trajectory of her remaining life. Regardless of the exact legal outcome, the core facts of the secret affair, the devastating HIV diagnosis, and her connection to Marcus Thorne's death were now part of the public record, irrevocably altering her life and reputation. Sentencing followed the verdict, determining the period of incarceration she would face. A state correctional facility, the very type of institution she had once commanded, would become her place of confinement. The irony was stark and profound. A warden now living life on the other side of the bars she had helped to manage. The disposition of the case marked the end of the legal battle, but the aftermath of the events extended far beyond the courtroom walls. The impact on Black Creek State Correctional Facility was significant. A security breach of this magnitude, involving the warden herself and an inmate, necessitated internal reviews, investigations, and potentially changes in protocol to prevent similar occurrences. Trust between staff and administration may have been damaged. The inherent dangers of the correctional environment, underscored by the extraordinary circumstances of this case. The families of both Sarah Chen and Marcus Thorne were left to grapple with the fallout. Thorne's family, whatever their history or relationship with him, lost a son, a relative, under brutal circumstances within a state institution. Sarah Chen's family faced the public shame, the legal consequences, and the personal devastation of her actions and diagnosis. Their lives were irrevocably altered by the choices she made, and the secrets she kept. The community of Milledgeville, and perhaps the broader state of Georgia, was left to process the unsettling reality of a figure of authority engaging in forbidden behavior with catastrophic results. The case served as a stark reminder of the human complexities and vulnerabilities that can exist even within the most rigid and controlled environments. The quiet devastation that began privately within Sarah Chen's life spread outwards, impacting the lives of many, leaving behind a wake of loss, distrust, and unanswered questions. The haunting consequences of the secret affair, the devastating diagnosis, and the violent act lingered long after the courtroom doors closed. This was not a narrative with a clean, resolved ending. The medical reality of Sarah Chen's diagnosis remained a lifelong challenge. The ethical and professional boundaries she crossed had resulted in the loss of her career, her freedom, and her standing in the community. Marcus Thorne's death, a violent end to a life already confined, was a tragic consequence of the dangerous dynamic that developed. The institutional failures, the human frailties, and the devastating interplay between private lives and public responsibilities were laid bare. The story of Warden Sarah Chen and inmate Marcus Thorne was a grim illustration of how hidden choices can have profound and irreversible public consequences, leaving behind a legacy of quiet devastation that resonated through the lives it touched and within the walls of the institution where the secret took root and violently ended. The silence that followed the verdict was heavy, filled with the weight of what was lost and the enduring shadow cast by secrets kept and boundaries broken.